This story blew up Germany back in 2008 when nurse Niels Hegel, who was given the mass media nickname Dr. Death, was suspected of a series of patient murders. It turned out that he was systematically injecting them with lethal doses of medication, not out of greed, but, according to him, to save them at the last moment heroically. Public attention was focused on his extravagant rescue methods, but most of his victims died. Despite his failures, Hegel did not stop, convinced that he was right. Investigators conducted 174 exhumations to prove his guilt. However, many of the potential victims have already been cremated, which suggests that the number of victims may exceed 300. Niels Hegel was born in 1977 in the small town of Wilhelmshaven to an ordinary German family. His father worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and his mother was a cleaner. As a child, Niels was not very considerate. He was moody and secretive. However, his classmates remember that he spent a lot of time alone, listening to radio, tuned to the police wave, and imagining himself a badass gangster who always manages to avoid police harassment. After graduating from high school, Niels decided to go to hospital college to become a nurse. He couldn't afford to go to a doctor because of his family's financial difficulties, so he decided to start with a nurse to gain experience and money, and then maybe go to medical school. In 1998, after graduating, he joined the Red Cross Clinic. He then moved to work as a nurse and assistant anesthesiologist in the cardiology department in Orenburg. However, Hegel soon fell on misfortunes. First, his father died of a heart attack. Then in a car accident, the pregnant wife died. Apparently, that's when he decided to take revenge on the world by killing those he felt didn't deserve the love of his loved ones. His first victim was 63-year-old Bridget Arndt, who was admitted to the clinic for an arrhythmia. The woman came with her daughter, who didn't even care about Niels. And the one before the surgery discreetly added to the patient's medication the drug from which she died on the way to the operating room. Immediately after the first murder, Hegel was afraid that he would be caught. He shuddered from his own shadow and trembled at any sound. The perp always thought he must have left some traces. However, time passed, and no police came for him. From there, Niels realized he had found the perfect environment to hunt his victims with impunity. Subsequently, forensic psychiatrists who examined him suggested that Niels was a boar killer. Hence his nurse's death experiments, which were interesting to him. If the murder of a 63-year-old woman had been investigated and solved, further deaths might have been avoided. However, it never occurred to anyone that someone would intentionally inject a patient with a lethal dose of the drug. It was at that moment that Niels felt a taste of impunity. Colleagues noted, however, that the mortality rate in the intensive care unit had almost doubled during his tenure. But these suspicions at first became obscured by the fantastic mastery with which Hegel pulled the sick from the afterlife. In the end, colleagues reported the incidents to the hospital administration, but not to the police. He wasn't even fired, just asked to leave voluntarily in exchange for a brilliant character reference. Located near Orenburg, a nurse arrived with such impressive recommendations that the management of the clinic had no choice but to hire him. In addition, in conversations with new colleagues, Hegel, as well as employees of the Orenburg Hospital, with ardor and heat, praised him with all means, without sparing praise. The Minhorst model, the killer, has been around longer than that, and it hasn't changed a bit. He found elderly patients, or those suffering from particularly serious illnesses, and injected a giant dose of potent agents with the slightest change in normal hypertension or arrhythmia. To prevent the drug's effects from being detected immediately, he switched off life support and the heart rate and blood pressure sensors, and then just sat there waiting for the victim to die. The drugs caused severe heart attacks, or even a heart attack, and the patient died, sometimes in the hands of Hegel himself, who pretended to fight for the patient's life. For a long time, the nurse remained above suspicion, even though of the 411 deaths recorded in this hospital during Hegel's tenure, 321 were on duty. The killer was caught at the scene of an accidental crime on June 24, 2005. The term Horst entered a patient's room and was surprised to see her colleague, Niels Hegel, leaning over him, who had nothing to do in that room. This was not the only oddity. The nurse discovered that the life support systems had been shut down, and on the table were 4 empty vials of a drug that no one had prescribed to the patient. She was worried and, just in case, took the patient's blood for testing. The results came the next day. A dangerous concentration of a powerful heart drug was found in the patient's blood. By then, however, he was dead. The employee immediately reported her suspicions to the attending doctor. They discussed the situation and decided to report the suspicious death to the police. However, the nurse himself was allowed to finish his shift. Amazingly, Niels managed to kill another patient. He was arrested only 2 days later. In 2008, Hegel was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for attempted murder. In 2012, while serving his sentence, Hegel told his cellmate that he had actually killed a lot of people. This conversation was passed on to the prison director, and an investigation was opened against Hegel. In early June 2019, the Orenburg court found Niels Hegel guilty of murdering 85 patients and sentenced him to life imprisonment. The investigators also focused their attention on senior staff at the hospital, where at various times it was not from Hegel who committed their crimes. For example, according to the prosecutor, the hospital authorities in the Minshorst case had concrete evidence that he had killed patients, but chose to remain silent in order not to damage the reputation of the clinic. 2 former senior physicians and the hospital administrator were soon brought to trial on charges of complicity in murder by duress. In 2005, Niels Hegel was arrested, and the newspapers came up with all sorts of predictable nicknames. Angel of Death, Killer Nurse. He didn't kill because he wanted to be famous as a CPR. Well, it's not just because of that. Hegel is a narcissist of the most terrible form. He not only wanted to be famous, he was interested. I am the game. He liked that he decided who lived, who died, and who rose from the dead. He liked to play God.
By contrast, the lawyers assured the jury that Dr. Death seemed to feel sorry for his victims. He killed them because he didn't want them to suffer in hospital wards, dying every day of hopelessness and inability to fight the disease. Complete nonsense, but some jurors even felt sorry for him. According to psychologists, the stress was responsible. His father died from a heart attack. Well, perhaps it was when he saw how tenderly his daughter cared for her mother. A wave of black envy swept through his head. Why did the inner voice in his head seem to scream, "Why does one get everything, and you only poverty, unbearable pain, suffering?" But then the desire for revenge in his soul seemed to burn out, leaving only a bitter hull of disappointment. Niels was simply bored. It was because of boredom that he conducted his experiments. I wonder if this patient will die from an overdose of drugs or not. Catch him where he devises the perfect way to kill him.